Good afternoon once again, ladies and gentlemen. After that quick song break, we are right here back with the Good News Radio, and the time right now is 3:33 p.m. and our next segment is English Classroom. So, today for the English Classroom, I thought we could speak about something that we were discussing during the English class here today. So if you don't know, the Foundation of Goodness conducts many English classes, and for kids, for teenagers, for adults, you name it, the foundation has all these various classes. So today in the class with some kids, something that came up was the passive voice, and some of the kids were actually finding this a little difficult, converting sentences from active voice to passive voice. So converting sentences from active voice to passive voice can be a little complex depending on the type of sentence. So first let's talk about what active voice is and what passive voice is. So active voice is how we say a sentence as it is. It could be a sentence in the present tense, it could be a sentence in the past tense. For example, I wrote a book. That is a sentence in the past tense, but it is active voice. Now what is passive voice and what is the difference between active voice and passive voice? Now, passive voice is a sentence construction where the focus is on the action. The focus is on the action that is performed rather than the subject who is performing the specific action. So if I may reiterate, what is passive voice? So when you're talking about passive voice, the focus is on the action or the task or whichever it is, however you'd like to call it, but the focus is on the action rather than the person who is doing the action. Usually our sentences are created as if so that we focus on the person. It could be I, it could be we, it could be they, it could be you, it could be a name of a person. For example, it could be Shashikala, it could be anyone, he, she, it. These are the people who are performing the action. These are not the only people, but it can be anyone. It can be students, it can be teachers, it can be any group of people, it can be a person. So this is the person who is performing the action in a sentence. In passive voice, we want to focus on the action instead of the person who is performing the action. So in passive voice, the object of an active sentence becomes the subject. So in passive voice, the object of an active sentence becomes subject. So in active voice, the subject can be I, you, we, they, or whoever the person is performing. But in passive voice, the object of an active sentence becomes the subject. So in active voice, the subject can be the person. In passive voice, the subject is the action or the task. And the verb often includes a form of to be and along with the past participle of the main verb. So what happens is when you're changing from active voice to passive voice, what needs to be done is we need to change the verb. Typically, the verb needs to be changed to the past participle of the verb. So remember two things. Typically, what is passive voice? Passive voice is when we focus on the action or the task rather than the person who is doing the action or the task. So that becomes the subject. The action or the task becomes the subject. And typically when we are talking in passive voice, or when we're converting a sentence from active voice to passive voice, the verb tends to be a past participle. The word verb that has been said in the active sentence tends to be a past participle. So let's look at a simple example. Maybe let's look at two examples. A simple sentence like, the chef cooked the meal. This is a sentence in active voice. The chef cooked the meal. Very simple sentence. There's only one subject, that is the chef. And what did the chef do? The chef cooked the meal. Now this is a very simple sentence in active voice. The chef cooked the meal, right? And who is the subject? The chef. And what was the chef doing? The chef cooked the meal. And notice how this sentence is also in the past tense. So this is not the same sentence in the present tense. So we will look at a different example of a sentence in the present tense. But this is a sentence in the past tense. So let me read the sentence again. The sentence in active voice is, the chef cooked the meal. Now, how do we convert this to passive voice? In passive voice, what it means is the action becomes the main point. The action becomes the subject. Now, let's look at what the action is in this sentence. The chef cooked the meal. The action or the task is the cooking of the meal, right? That is the task. And now how do we convert that to passive voice? So now if the task is to take center stage, if the action is going to be the main point or is going to be the center stage, that has to take primary. So the meal was cooked by the chef. So active voice, the chef cooked the meal. Passive voice, the meal was cooked by the chef. And why? What's the difference between these two? Let's revisit the difference. Active voice, the person who is doing the task. What's the task? Cooking of the meal. Who is the person doing the task? The chef. And the person who's doing the task is the subject. In active voice, the chef cooked the meal. Notice who cooked the meal? Chef. So the chef is the subject. In active voice, we take the action as the subject. The meal was cooked by the chef. The meal was cooked by the chef. The action takes primary focus or center stage. The meal was cooked by the chef. Right. Let's look at another example. A sentence in active voice. She completed the project. She completed the project. Now, who completed the project? It's she. It could be, the subject could be anyone. It could be he, she. It could be, it could be he, she, or it could be a name, right? But the sentence here is, she completed the project, and this sentence is also in the past tense. So she completed the project. Subject is she, and the action or the task is the completion of the project. How do we convert this active past tense sentence, active sentence in active voice in the past tense to passive voice? Now, what is the task or the action of the sentence? The completion of the project, right? So the project was completed by her. So completed became was completed. The project was completed by her. The project was completed by her. So she completed the project, active voice. When it comes to passive voice, the project was completed by her. And also notice how completed became was completed. And even in the previous example, the chef cooked the meal. The meal was cooked by the chef. So it's not only interchanging the subject and the object, or the subject and the task, but the verb cooked became was cooked. The word completed became was completed. So there has to be a change in the verb, where the verb form changes to the past participle. So let's quickly reiterate those two examples. The sentence in the active voice is the chef cooked the meal, and how we convert that to passive voice is the meal was cooked by the chef. And the second example is the sentence in active voice was she completed the project. How we convert it into passive voice is the project was completed by her. Now notice how in the first example it was the chef, right? And even when we convert the active voice to passive voice, the meal was cooked by the chef. Chef and chef didn't change. Active voice read, the chef cooked the meal. Passive voice read, the meal was cooked by the chef. So like we discussed before, cooked became was cooked, but the chef remained the same. However, notice in the second example, she completed the project, and the passive voice read, the project was completed by her. The project was completed by her. She became her. So for subjects like she, he, becomes her, and he becomes him. If the sentence read, he completed the project, we can say in passive voice, the project was completed by him. The project was completed by him. So she became her, and if it read he would become he. So that's how the sentences, when you use she, he, will transform. What if it said they completed the project? So the active voice sentence would read they completed the project. Then how would a passive voice sentence be? How would the passive voice sentence be? So let's convert the active voice sentence they completed the project to passive voice. The project was completed by them. The project was completed by them. So notice how she became her, he became him, and they became them. So point to note is when you're having she, he, and they as subjects, it turns out to be the other form. So let's go over that again. She completed the project, active voice. In passive voice, the project was completed by her. Active voice, he completed the project. Passive voice, the project was completed by him. Active voice, they completed the project. Passive voice, the project was completed by them. So those are the subtle nuances in when we are using she, he, them, and there can be other differences when we use other subject nouns as well. Let's go over a few examples so that we will figure them out as we go along. Now, when do we use passive voice? I feel like that's an important point. When do we use passive voice in general? Why do we use passive voice? So, when to use passive voice is when the doer of the action is unknown or unimportant. When the doer of the action is unknown or unimportant. What does that mean? Now, referring back to the previous examples about the chef cooked the meal, and when in passive voice, it's the meal was cooked by the chef. Now, yes, we converted that active voice to passive voice, and the doer of that is important, right? The doer is important. And we used that as an example to really show how we can convert active active voice to passive voice. But we wouldn't always use such sentences. We would, but not always when we are speaking or writing. But when do we usually use passive voice? When do we do that? That is when the doer or the action is unknown or unimportant. For example, if you're saying, a mistake was made. A mistake was made. Now, do we know who did this mistake? No, we don't. We have no idea about who did this mistake. But we are saying a mistake was made, and we can end the sentence there. Full stop. We end the sentence there. A mistake was made. It doesn't matter who did it, and we might not even know who did it, right? But in instances like that, we can use passive voice. Of course, if we know the person, right, let's say we are saying her, a mistake was made by her. If you're telling someone else about a mistake that was made, you can say a mistake was made by her. Right? You can say that in passive voice. Or you can simply use active voice. She made a mistake. She made a mistake. So we converted passive voice to active voice. Whereas before we converted active voice to passive voice. But ideally, when do we use this is when we don't really know the doer of the action. A mistake was made. Right? A mistake was made. Okay. When do we use passive voice more frequently? Apart from when we don't know who the doer of the action is. Another instance is when emphasizing the action or the result rather than the doer. When emphasizing the action or the task or the result rather than the subject or rather than the person who is doing the action. So that is what we initially discussed was what is passive voice. We said passive voice is when the action or the task takes dominance or priority. Right? So when we are emphasizing the action or the result rather than the doer, we typically use passive voice. For example, the law was passed in 2020. What is important here? The important thing is the law of the passing of the law. So the law was passed in 2020, and that is the action, or that's the result or the task, whichever. But that is the important part and not who did it. It could have been done by someone, the judge, or we can say the Supreme Court or someone, right? But the important part is the action, and hence we stop the sentence there. The law was passed in 2020. We use passive voice for it and we end the sentence there. And another instance we use passive voice is in formal or scientific writing. In formal or scientific writing, the experiment was conducted successfully. Here again, the doer or the person who is doing the action is not mentioned, and we are simply saying the experiment was conducted successfully. The experiment was conducted successfully. Right? So in scientific form, in scientific writing also we typically tend to use passive voice. So those are some of the examples or some of the instances rather we use passive voice. So a quick recap. What is passive voice? Passive voice is a sentence construction where the focus is on the action being performed rather than the subject performing the action. What does that mean? Passive voice is a sentence construction where we focus on the action or the task or the thing that's been done in the sentence rather than the person who is doing the action. Rather than the person who is doing the action, or rather than the subject. A simple example is the chef cooked the meal, the meal was cooked by the chef. Passive voice, the meal was cooked by the chef. And in that sentence, we are focusing on the meal that was cooked and by the chef. Another simple example is, she completed the project. The project was completed by her. Active voice is, she completed the project, and passive voice is, the project was completed by her. Notice how she completed became was completed, and she became her. So we took examples of past tense, right? The active voice was in the past tense. She completed the project, that's in past tense. So we looked at examples that are in the past tense. So perhaps next week we will look at examples which are in the present tense. So until then, see you next week. And with that we bring about the end of the English classroom segment. The time right now is 3:53 p.m. We at Good News Radio, we will be here till 5 p.m. and we will be here next week as well. So do stay tuned with us till 5 p.m. and we will be right back after this quick song break with our next segment.